Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. How are you, Peter?
I am doing well, thank you, James. How's your summer going?
Fine. Yes, good. Do you notice anything new about me?
Is it your t-shirt?
Well, the t-shirt is new. Thanks for noticing, but that wasn't what I had in mind.
Is it that your hair's even longer?
Well, that is the natural process that goes. A full head of hair. Thank you very
Do you
much.
mean to say it's actually your glasses?
Yes, that was where I was going, but you've kind of ruined it by not going there first. So, but yes, everyone, hopefully you can see I've got new glasses. They are now round. The previous ones I had were rectangle like yours, but that is increasingly seen as old-fashioned, and round is all the rage. And so I've gone for a round pair from Boots, actually, and I think they're fantastic. Green as well for a bit of an edge.
A bit of an edge. Are you saying that you are edgy, James?
Yes, I self-define as edgy, so I suppose.
In today's age of self-definition,
that's it. You know, no one can argue with me because that's me and my truth. So why would you say I'm not edgy?
One could think of many words to describe you.
Yes, James, maybe we'll do a whole podcast on that one day. But, how is your summer going?
No, it's been very good, thank you. It's been very good.
You're about to have a very long time off, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yes.
But I'm sure these things.
So are we all.
I'm sure these things all balance out in terms of the amount of time we all take off, don't they, James?
Well, I don't know if that's true actually, because I quite often because I understand the words of Jesus when he talks about servant leadership. I quite often don't take my fully allotted holiday entitlement because I want to be here for my team. I want to make sure that you can all have time off and have a good amount of time off, and so I sacrifice in that way.
Really?
Yes.
But I believe it all rolls over anyway. So
some of it rolls over. That's
anyway. Shall we get on to what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I'm actually quite excited, if I'm honest, about what we're going to talk about today. And I guess in part because it will allow us to delve into lots of the Bible, which is always very exciting. But it probably is worth us explaining why we're going to be talking about this particular topic. And so before we announce the topic, we can't really go any further without acknowledging that the last few weeks, certainly since we last recorded the podcast, have been pretty horrendous in terms of the stress that's been placed on the social fabric of our nation. And Britain is a multicultural society. We have people from so many different countries who have come to live here, make their home here, and yet in recent weeks we've seen tensions between different communities, reminiscent of the 2011 riots. So those of you watching, listening, you might remember them or you might not remember them, but 2011 there was riots in London, other parts it spread, and it was really horrendous. And what we saw in recent days and recent weeks, where we had the far right and we had Muslim groups and we had other people, and just this horrendous sense that everything was about to kind of blow up.
Yeah, I think that is right. Obviously, the trigger point for all that has unfolded since was the absolutely awful incident in Southport, with effectively the murder of 3 children there, and then that sparked off various rumours and fake news online about the ethnicity and the religion of the murderer, in which effectively lies were being spread online.
Yeah.
That it was someone who was Muslim, and lies that they had crossed the channel in a small boat. Both of those things are wrong. He was born in Cardiff about 20 years ago. He is of Rwandan heritage initially. His parents were probably Christian. So that was the initial thing which sparked it. And then from there, I guess you've had far-right groups organising themselves to instigate riots and violence and hatred, particularly against Muslim communities, which has been pretty disturbing.
No, it's been horrendous. It's been a horrific. And actually, I think a lot of criticism has been levelled at the police by some in terms of accusations of two-tier policing. But I think it is probably our starting point should be gratitude for the bravery, the courage, whatever one might say about mistakes or otherwise. I want to start by acknowledging that if you're dressing up in riot gear and you're putting yourself in the way of harm, then you are doing a public service. I don't care, what accusations you might level at the police. I think that's where I want to start, by saying thank you for helping to and doing a job that frankly I would never want to do, and I wouldn't want anyone I'm particularly close to do. I mean, it's just it's an awful job and really, really difficult to have things thrown at you, etc., etc.
It is. It is, and I think this whole conversation is a massively nuanced thing. If people are looking to think about it in more detail, we've written 2 blogs on it in the last couple of weeks. Our CEO Ross wrote something on it a couple of weeks ago. I wrote another piece last Friday where we get into some of these questions in more detail. I do think that there is a point, and this can potentially lead us in actually to where we're heading. I do think there is a point around institutions cannot be immune from criticism. So just to come back on you slightly, and to some extent we saw earlier in the year where the post office had been immune from criticism, and then that led to things going wrong. Government should not be immune to criticism, and to some extent, and I'm sure the police would recognise this themselves, given that actually the day we're recording, Metropolitan Police had something, basically a report's gone into their behaviour in a whole load of areas across the last few years, and in 8 out of the 9 they were doing an inadequate job. So the police is also not immune from criticism. That is, again, I think we preface all of this by saying that any rioting is a disgrace and people should be locked up for it. But I think institutions cannot be immune from criticism. And so there are questions around what the role is for these different institutions, and are they managing it effectively? And that goes for police. It also goes for government, which is what we're actually looking to focus on today.
I mean, I think to just to go back slightly, I wasn't in any way suggesting institutions are immune from criticism, but rather I was saying that for the police officers who have had to stand in the midst of rioting crowds and do their job, whatever criticisms rightly can be levelled at them, that takes a degree of courage that I lack. And I'm glad I don't have to do. And I think that X has not helped and Twitter has not helped, because I think it has also pushed a lot of Christians into making these incredibly definitive statements about everything, of which we are just wholly ill-qualified to make judgments on. And there is a wisdom in restraint, and there is a wisdom in discerning what we can criticise from a sort of position of not being an expert in modern policing, for example. And I think that's where I was particularly disappointed that the response, and maybe this is just what the platform X does, it just was so binary. You were either, you had one slant which was, the far right is awful. Well, I 100% agree. Tommy Robson, whatever his name is a dreadful, dreadful person. Yeah. Okay, versus then you had the other view, which was 2-tier policing, and isn't this awful? And it's immigration, that's the problem. And again, as so often happens, any room for kind of nuance and for being able to go, there's a legitimate point here, and I can understand where you're coming from here. Social media just does not lend itself to that, and yet, maybe the answer is that we just all need to get off X.
Well, in some ways, I think the world would be a much simpler place.
It'd be a much happier place, wouldn't it?
I think one of the problems with social media is you see clips circulating online, and if you just see a clip without context, you think something is very black and white and very clear. And clips don't necessarily show context, and there will be reasons why the police are intervening in one situation and they're not intervening in another situation, and it might be that actually they've been overwhelmed and therefore they can't do something, or it might be that it is a better strategic decision in the short term for them to not get involved, but the full force of the law will be applied later. And on something like X, which I will never get out of the habit of calling Twitter,
you in the world,
you can't see those judgment calls or the bigger things which are going into it. And I guess in another way, about last month, we had another indication of how you don't get full context from sort of short clips. So there was that video, wasn't there, at the airport?
Yes.
Where I think it was police were filmed, a police man.
Yes, it was a man,
was filmed kicking someone on the floor.
Yes.
And you release a short clip of that was released, and actually in the longer clip there'd been an enormous fight. And so you can't get things we can't get a full picture of stuff from a short clip, and that's one of the massive problems I have.
And what it has done is it has led to a really fascinating debate around the limits of free speech.
Yeah.
And I was struck by this today because Spectator were carrying a piece on it, Times had a piece on it, and Telegraph had a piece on it. This seems to be where the conversation has moved to, and it's partly been driven by the owner of X, Elon Musk, who's been saying that free speech is in crisis, etc., etc. And this also raises another kind of so the question is: are you a free speech absolutist? Do you take the position that there should be zero limits on free speech at all, or do you take a kind of slightly less absolutist position and go, I think there should be some limits, but that is difficult to police, and we go into it acknowledging that. And then, just to make things even more enjoyable, we get into the realm of how do you police speech online? The whole, you take the Online Safety Act, it's been 6 years from Green Paper all the way through to the Act being passed by both houses, receiving royal assent, and it has still not been fully implemented. That, one of the reasons it took so long is because everybody knew this is complicated. We're appointing a regulator and we're placing a new duty on social media companies where we shift the burden onto them to say, we now expect you to be proactive in shutting down and getting rid of content that would incite violence. And of course, one of the warnings that came during that debate was if you do that, then social media companies will overreact and be overly zealous, and legitimate content online, so-called legal but harmful, I mean, that's very subjective, you'll end up in this situation where, perfectly acceptable content is being removed. But the flip side is, we've seen misinformation leading to people committing acts and crimes on our streets. And so you look at that and you're like, how a free speech absolutist can go, it's not social media companies' fault. It's not the fault of algorithms or anything like that. And if we had even more free speech, that would happen less. Arguably, if we had more free speech, wouldn't it happen more under that logic? But then the reverse side is, I think of 1 Timothy 2 passage that we're always referencing, and we're to pray for those in authority precisely so that we are able to get on with gossiping the gospel, which involves speech, I believe. So it's not what we're going to talk about today. We should talk about free speech at some point.
It'd be a fascinating conversation.
But my goodness, this debate is now live, and I think as Christians we need to be very, very thoughtful about how we engage, because on the one hand I want to be like, yes to free speech. On the other hand, I want to be like, I'm not sure absolute free speech, no limits at all, is necessarily a good idea.
So I guess where this is leading to is what is the place of government. What actually is government's role in setting the laws within a society, and what is not its role? So what does it have authority from God to do? What does it not have authority to do? And obviously you have different systems of government, and some of those are particularly authoritarian when it comes to what you can and can't say, and others are more liberal.
That's a good point, because actually we have a lot more free speech in this country in comparison to, say, I don't know, North Korea.
Quite.
That's a slight pushback on Mr. Musk, perhaps.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Well, let's talk about it then. So we want to talk about God and government, and I was quite struck recently. Let me say a couple of introductory things, and then let's see where that takes us. The first thing that I would want to say is I've been really helped in thinking about God and government and what the Bible says by an essay by Professor Julian Rivers in a book called God and Government. And in this essay, he talks about the fact that biblically, government is first of all legitimate, that it is it's not the only, it's one of the authority structures that God has designed for his world. So it's legitimate. But the second thing is, it is limited, and it's limited in two ways. The first way it's limited is because there are other authority structures, the most obvious being the church. And to use two symbols that we find in the Bible, God has given the sword of judgment to the state. He's given the keys of the kingdom to the church. So that's one. But it's limited in another way, which is Jesus said in the Gospels, don't fear the one who can put you in prison. Fear instead the one who has the authority to send your soul to hell. And so government is limited in the sense that, yes, it has power, but it compared to God's power, it is a limited power. Compared to, the power that you or I have as individuals, it's massive, it's colossal. But next to the authority that God has, it cannot be compared. It's not the same. I've always found that really helpful. The one caveat I would add is I think some people watching this might hear the word limited and associate it immediately with a kind of political statement. And I want to say that's not how Professor Julian Rivers is using it in his essay at all. Although, from a Christian point of view, there's a really fascinating question around what is state overreach and what's not. But I throw that out so that if you are someone who naturally leans to the left, you don't need to hear what I've just said and the use of the word limited and freak out that I mean small state. It must be a small state. It just must be. That's not what I'm necessarily saying, and that's not what Professor Rivers means. I found that super helpful. So that's the first big thing. What do you make of that? It's hard to disagree with it, isn't it?
I'm sort of like one of those questions.
Try and disagree with that.
What am I going to say in response? I agree.
But helpful in terms of a kind of big starting point.
I think it is helpful to think of it in those terms. I think kind of I also, reading in advance of this, found the distinction between state and church, different spheres, being helpful. I guess the other thing for us to think about, which if we were to think of a Venn diagram and you think of two circles,
yes,
and people sometimes will think of government on one hand and will think of God on the other.
Yeah.
And that is not actually the way we are to view it as Christians. And there is the classic passage, which I'm assuming you are looking at this very moment.
I am heading there right now, like you would not believe. And of course,
you can't find it. I think it's after that.
Memory has served me really well.
You're looking for Give to Caesar.
I'm looking for it, and thankfully it has that as a kind of subheading.
Yeah.
And so I've got it. It's Mark 12. It's Mark 12, Peter.
It had to be after he got to Jerusalem. But
I just forgotten where it was.
Yeah, don't worry.
I once learned all the words of Jesus from Mark's Gospel. Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
I've said that many times. But
do you want to read out just a little bit from that passage?
I'll do it from memory. That finally made Isaac laugh. That's our producer. All right, Mark 12. Let me read it from verse 13. So later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the poll tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. What a gift to be able to see through people. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him.
Fantastic, thank you. Well,
that's you. It sounds like you're leading a Bible study. That's exactly what you say if someone's just read. That's great. Thank you so much for reading. Yeah.
So I guess from that, it might be tempting to think of, in your Venn diagram, one circle with Caesar on one hand and one circle with God on the other.
And equal circles, right?
Yeah.
That's how it can be conceptualized.
Whereas actually, I think what we would want to say as Christians is that you've got your Caesar circle, fine, but it's within a much bigger circle of God. And actually, we might be able to understand that in a kind of analogous way from somewhere else, also in Mark 12. So when Jesus is teaching about what is the greatest commandment, and he says, well, you've got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength and your mind, and you've got to love your neighbour as yourself. And in some ways, we're actually quite used to the idea, aren't we, that part of loving God is loving our neighbour. It's like a subset of loving God. Or if you were to think about back in Micah, for instance, when Micah is saying, like, what does the Lord require of you?
Yes.
And it's to act justly, and it's to love mercy, and it's to walk humbly before you are God. And so actually, like, loving neighbour is part of loving God.
Absolutely.
Giving to Caesar is part, ultimately, of giving to God.
And of course, let's just, on God's authority being bigger, let's just remember, Psalm 24 verse 1, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters." Or you could go, for example, to Psalm 93, The Lord reigns. He's robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armor of strength. Indeed, the world is established firm and secure. Your throne was established long ago. You are from all eternity. And so you're absolutely right. But the point Jesus makes that's so challenging, I think, is he affirms the legitimacy of Caesar's authority. Now, that's not the be-all and end-all. That is not the final word from the New Testament on Caesar's authority. But he's saying, yeah, Caesar has a right to ask for tax. And so therefore, you Jewish people, you may not like it, you may resent it because you have been occupied by an invading force. But he has a God-given right to demand that tax from you, and you should pay it. Yeah. That is absolutely staggering. I mean, it's just amazing.
Well, I was sort of similar. I was similarly thinking, well, when Jesus is before Pilate, and Jesus says, well, you would have no authority over me had it not been handed to you from above.
Yes.
And actually in that conversation, we get one of these things which can again lead to a misconception where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And Jesus isn't saying, well, you've got my world over here and you've got...
Yes, that's right.
You've got your world over here.
One kingdom.
Like Jesus is the king who has come from heaven, but who is king of this world too.
And it's impossible for, that idea to be true that you've just mentioned, quite apart from what you've just said, but also the very first words Jesus begins his ministry with is in Mark is, the kingdom of God is at hand. It has come near in him. It's the age to come has broken into this world.
Yes.
I actually, in doing quite a lot of thinking recently about God and government, when I initially conceived how I was going to structure, this is a new resource, by the way, that we'll be bringing out later this year, God and Government. When I'd initially conceived it, it was going to kind of lead to a climax around the rule and the reign of Jesus. But actually, I've reversed it because I think if you go to the New Testament, then the emphasis is not on, first and foremost, the authority of the civil government. The emphasis is on this radical political claim. Jesus is Lord. Kurios. He's Lord of all. And that's what Peter says when he's in that fascinating episode with Cornelius. He just happens to drop in. He's like, Jesus is Lord of all. And that's why it's legitimate for me to kind of mix with Gentiles because he's Lord of all. And so in the context of the Roman Empire, where Caesar was Lord of all in the sense, and there were many other gods, Christians were remarkably countercultural. They were revolutionaries in that sense because they were saying, no, Jesus is Lord, which is just, so we need to start there. When we think about God and government, we need to start there, I think, with that claim, Jesus is Lord. I mean, how would you, if you were sort of trying to summarize the lordship of Jesus, what are some of the words that we would want to use? Where are the passages that might help us?
Colossians 1.
Yeah. Fantastic.
It feels like an obvious one.
That's a great one. Big one.
Well, I was sort of just thinking, so this is a slight tangent, and so I take it you're looking up Colossians 1 as we're speaking.
Yeah, I was going to go to another one.
I was actually just thinking, coming off the back of that, about I guess common misconceptions we have as Christians sometimes, and I do know we need to kind of go back to our topic shortly. But I think there are two common misconceptions about the ancient world, which as Christians we sometimes have. The first is that the early Christians' theology wasn't political, when it was. Jesus was king. That is a political claim, because if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not.
Yeah.
The second misconception we sometimes have about the ancient world is that the Romans' politics wasn't theological. Because it was.
Of course it was.
The Romans didn't just say that Caesar was Lord, they said Caesar was God. And so you have all the early emperors are claimed to be gods. And so Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord, and Jesus is God, not Caesar is God.
Yeah, absolutely. And any political theology, which is really what we're talking about, starts here from a Christian perspective. It starts with the fact that I was reading Hebrews recently, and I was focusing in particular on the first kind of 4 verses, and I was really struck by the fact that, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed, heir of all things. Now, the first bit is the supremacy of the revelation that the Son is of God, and he's uniquely qualified to reveal God to us. But it's the fact then it says he's the heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he'd provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven, the position of absolute authority, the position, funnily enough, that James and John were quite eager to have for themselves. And he's so humble, Jesus. He didn't go, yeah, I'm sat there. He responded by saying, it's not for you to know who's going to sit where in heaven. But that position, this is kind of echoing Philippians 2 language. As a result of Jesus' willingness to humble himself, God has exalted him to the highest possible place. And so, there is no human authority, be it Putin or Kim Jong-un, however humanly powerful they are, it doesn't even begin to compare to the authority that Jesus has.
Yeah.
And then you add in the Old Testament teaching of God is the one, Jesus is the one who raises up rulers and brings them down. This is not some kind of like comparison of equals going on here. There is one supreme ruler, and that's Jesus. And thank goodness, because of course then we get into his character, his lowliness, his gentleness, his wisdom, and so on. That's where we start with God and government.
Yes. So I guess we've focused so far on where does government come from? What's government's provenance? And it comes from God.
It does.
That's where we start. In terms of the function of what government is for,
yes.
What are some of the early places in the Bible where we see government initially being provided?
You've got to go to Genesis 1, and you've got to start with what we would commonly call the cultural, or I think I prefer creation mandate. And this is right after we read that God made human beings in his image, male and female. Then he moves to bless them. And for our purposes, listen to this. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And I think what I find so fascinating here is I think that this is part of what it means to be an image bearer.
Yeah.
God rules, and because we're made in his image, we're given a command, but we also have the capacity not to rule the universe like God does, that's beyond us, but we're able to rule within this delegated sphere that God has given us.
Yeah.
And what I also find so interesting is I think you have the beginnings. Again, this will be fleshed out later, so you can't completely conclude this from here. But this is supposed to be a shared endeavor. Power is not to be focused just in one person. It's not just Adam who's supposed to basically be the boss and everyone just kind of like does what he says. So in that sense, I think C.S. Lewis. Now, this is interesting. I'm about to potentially criticize C.S. Lewis, so I'm going to trigger you like you would not believe.
Oh, not necessarily.
No, So in C.S. Lewis, when he in Magician's Nephew, and he may well be right here because I'm not sure, but the humans who come into the world, you've got Diggory, you've got Polly, but you've also got, I think it's Frank and then his wife Helen, and they become the king and queen, and he's trying to echo Genesis 1 in terms of they're to rule over the animals. So it's not the animals who get the authority, the talking animals, it's a man and a woman, and I think he's modeling that a little bit on sort of the Adam and Eve character going on there in Magician's Nephew, which is all fine, but I think as humanity procreated and as it filled the earth, I think that the idea that, Adam and Eve would function as a sort of, superior king and queen, I'm just not sure that is exactly what would have happened had the fall not taken place.
As in, are you comparing Frank and Helen to the animals?
No, Frank and Helen are like Adam and Eve.
Well, no, as in. How we're now arguing over Narnia, which is not over scripture.
It was inevitable. But do you see but you get my point. My point is that this God blessed them, plural, and the mandate isn't given to just Adam and Eve. This is a mandate that applies to all humanity. So ruling is a shared endeavor. It's to say that in this perfect world that God had created, I think Adam and Eve would have had a particular responsibility as the first man and the first woman to pass on the instructions that God had given them. Yeah. But the responsibility to rule was a function of being an image bearer.
Completely.
And that's why.
Okay. So is the objection really that they are made the king and queen of Narnia?
Yes, Yes, sorry, I should have been clearer. Yes, I'm not sure that I think it conveys perhaps that's like the wrong idea. But anyway, but I guess actually more the point is that leadership was not sort of, or the authority was not solely given to Adam. Yeah, it was from the very beginning. He needed a helper.
Yeah, indeed.
To fulfill this task. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's absolutely right.
So that's where it begins. It's a function of being made in the image of God that humans have something within us, and we see this. I rule over my flat. I do it with my wife, right? But I bring order to it when I tidy, when I straighten, when I organize. That is me in a very, very silly example, fulfilling an imaging God who brings order out of chaos.
Or indeed not, depending on how tidy or untidy the
of
flat
course.
is. Great. And then I guess one of the kind of seminal texts then in terms of foundation of government comes in Genesis 9, doesn't it? Where you have provision, I guess, for the first sort of law as such. So why don't I read this one out? So this is Genesis 9 verse 5. I actually might go off your Bible because I think the NIV will be better on this than the Good News is.
It's good news. Oh, goodness.
So
you are rogue, aren't you?
It's purely because it was the first one to hand.
Yeah.
So Genesis 9:5. For your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by human beings shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made humanity.
Yeah.
I guess there are a few things to spot with that. So the first one is God's principles for government are based on humans being made in his image.
Yeah.
So that is the reason for the law he lays down here, is in the image of God has God made humanity. I guess the second thing is governments ultimately are accountable to God. So from every human being, I, that is God, will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. So it's not simply a matter of if someone murders someone else and they're accountable to the state. Ultimately, they will be held accountable to God as well. And the reason why any government ultimately should be fulfilling this kind of law is not just for its own sake. It is because they are accountable to God and they have authority which has come from him, like we have already looked at. A third principle in that, which I think is quite a helpful one, is the idea of justice being proportional.
Yeah.
And again, this is so rooted in understanding the ancient world, where justice was so often not proportional. And you actually do see that in places in the Old Testament. So I think it's the story, or is it the story of Dinah, who is sexually abused by people from one of the neighbouring cities, and so Dinah's brothers then go in and they murder like everyone in the city. Like justice is so often not proportional in the ancient world, but this lays down a proportional penalty, life for life, effectively.
And I think that I think someone could legitimately agree with all of that, but then ask the question, how do you get from Genesis 9, 5 and 6 to government? And I think the answer is yes. You're not going to find the word government here in the text, but I think the context is how we get there. So Genesis 9, 1 and 7 is God repeating to Noah the cultural mandate, the creation mandate, fill the earth. And then I think the language of verse 2 and 3 is him repeating the idea of ruling and subduing. But of course, the language has changed slightly because unlike Genesis 1:28, Genesis 9 comes in the context of a fallen, broken, ruined world. And sin is present there. And so what we have is everything is starting again after the flood, but the context in which we obey the creation mandate has fundamentally changed. And that I would argue, intensifies the need for the focus of government less to be about the ordering of society and the making sure that the resources are well stewarded. I think that still remains. But now there's a particular need for governments to exercise justice. It's a ministry of justice that God, I think, has especially called them to. And the reason I think you can get to government is because, again, if Noah and his family are to procreate and they're to fill the earth, and they are, then you just have to work from a position of logic and say, well, as they do that, as humanity grows and as it expands, because this is a sinful world, and remember, the first major sin after Adam and Eve is murder, because this is a sinful world, it's not illogical to say they would have had to set up some kind of institution in order to fulfill this, because otherwise every person's going to be a vigilante. Every person's charging around, effectively carrying out their own justice and taking it into their own hands. And I think instead what this text gives us is it kind of gives us the foundation or the basis for saying humanity would have figured out, if we're going to obey this and have proportionate justice, then we need things like a trial, and we need some kind of judgment system, and we need a government in order to be able to fulfill this. I think that's how you get there.
Yeah, I think the rule of law,
Yes.
sort of almost kind of presupposes, doesn't it?
Yes,
that
absolutely
there is an accountability towards someone or something,
And-
and so you have to have some sort of
Absolutely.
execution.
And you can tell, therefore, this too is also God's design for post-fall world, because this is in the context of his creation. Yes, with Noah, but I think you can call it a creation covenant. In that this is still in force today. This has not been overturned or superseded. This is God's covenant with the created world to say, I will not judge you again with a flood until Jesus comes back. And in this post-fall world, you're going to need governments, and they need to exercise justice.
That could lead to a very interesting conversation another time about the place of capital punishment. But we can save that one for another time.
And we should save it, because actually, if you go to Romans 13, it comes up again.
Yeah.
And so there's fascinating. But let's do that another time. That's Old Testament. We should probably add in maybe at least a brief. I don't know how are we doing for time.
Let's not worry.
We don't have time. We'll have to do part 2.
Well,
we can't not talk about Romans 13.
Why don't we keep going, and we can split up the episode if we have to.
It's very good. Keep this bit in, the actual dialogue in the episode about how we're going to split this up. And what do you think about the marketing strategy for this? That's fine. Okay, so we've laid the basis.
Yeah,
that's really what we've done here. Let's just draw stumps.
I mean,
here.
this is so far we have only looked at God's commands for all of humanity.
Yes.
So these are principles before God reveals himself to Abraham and the nation of Israel.